Police officers occupy unique positions of power and responsibility in our society. They hold positions of public trust, and they commit themselves to public service. They are accountable to the communities that they serve. And Brooklyn Center police officers are no exception. Their fundamental duty is to protect the sanctity of life. To do this job, the job of a Brooklyn Center police officer, they promise to safeguard lives. They promise to serve and protect, to maintain calm and develop self-restraint, and to be constantly mindful of the welfare of others. They promise never to employ unnecessary force or abuse. This is the oath of a Brooklyn Center police officer. I will never betray my badge, my integrity, my character, or the public interest. I will always have the courage to hold myself and others accountable for our actions. This is the standard they hold themselves to, and they take an oath to do so. Their duty to their badge and to the community is to protect life, not to take life. Now, they are also required to abide by a code of ethics. This serves as a type of compact or an agreement between each of the officers and the public that they serve. It sets forth what the community, what the public should expect from each and every one of them. It affirms that the badge is a symbol of public faith and public trust, and that the officers are each individually responsible for their own professional performance. And they each vow to take every opportunity to enhance and improve the level of their knowledge and competence. These officers carry deadly weapons every day on the job, and they receive extensive training in order to carry them. They're trained professionals. They're entrusted by the public with these weapons. Every day they put on their uniforms and they go to work, and they go to work out on the streets of our communities. They're trained to do this job. They're trained to interact with people of all walks of life, trained to interact with people in crisis, trained to interact with people on their worst days, trained to interact with people who may very well not want to interact with them at all. And every day that they go to work, they're required to be alert, attentive, and capable of performing their duties. Every day that they strap on that duty belt with their guns and their tasers, they have to be alert, attentive, and capable. And every day they do this, we entrust them with our lives. These officers have the responsibility to be mindful and attentive and acutely aware of the weapons that they carry and the risks associated with those weapons. They have the responsibility to follow their duty and their training when it comes to those weapons, and they have the responsibility to carry those weapons and use those weapons appropriately. We trust them not to use those weapons rashly or recklessly, and we expect not to be shot dead on the street for no reason. We expect them not to betray their badge, and we expect them to uphold their oath. We trust them to know wrong from right and left from right. This case is about an officer who knew not to get it dead wrong. But she failed to get it right. This case is about the defendant, Kimberly Potter, betraying her badge and betraying her oath and betraying her position of public trust. And on April 11th of this year, she betrayed a 20-year-old kid. She pulled out her firearm, she pointed it at his chest, and she shot and killed Dante Wright. Now, the defendant was a 26-year veteran of the Brooklyn Center Police Force. For 26 years, she went out on the streets with the obligation to serve and protect. She had those same duties and those same responsibilities as every other Brooklyn Center police officer. That same fundamental duty to protect the sanctity of life and to safeguard life. She was bound by the same rules, the same policies, and she was bound by the same code of ethics. And you'll hear about the Brooklyn Center policies. We'll touch on those a little bit. And you'll hear about the defendant's training on things like the use of force, the use of firearms, and the use of a taser. And you'll hear she was trained not to use unnecessary force. She was trained not to shoot an unarmed driver. She was trained not to fire into a vehicle. And she was also trained not to use her taser on a fleeing suspect. And she was trained to be aware of the differences between her gun and her taser. And importantly, she was also trained about the risks of pulling the wrong weapon, and that drawing and firing the wrong weapon could kill someone. Now, you'll learn about her firearm. It's a 9mm Glock handgun. And you'll hear about how the Brooklyn Center Police Department uses hollow point ammunition as their standard ammunition. That's the kind of ammunition that expands on impact. It peels back the metal in layers when it hits its target. Now, this peeling action, it can slow down a bullet, but it can also cause extensive damage to the body in that way. This is a common type of ammunition used by law enforcement. And not only will you hear about the ammunition and the firearm, you'll hear about her taser, a Taser 7. Now, a taser is a conducted energy weapon that shoots out 2 probes when you press the trigger. And those probes are supposed to attach to the skin and deliver an electric shock. And they do this because they're designed to incapacitate someone through something called neuromuscular incapacitation. And basically what that means is your muscle seize up so you can't move. And they can also be used to inflict pain. And you'll hear about the weapons from the witnesses in this case. But every day that the defendant, Kimberly Potter, went to work, she strapped on her duty belt with her gun and her taser and all of the other options available to her on that belt. And every day she put on her duty belt, she carried her weapons in the same way. She carried her Glock, her firearm, on her right side. The defendant is right-handed. She carried it on her right side, her dominant side. And she carried her taser on her left side, her non-dominant side. Something you might also hear referred to as her reaction side in some of these policies. She was trained to carry her weapons in this way, and she was trained on how to use them and how not to use them. And you will hear about that training, and you will learn that she had firearm training and taser training every single year. She had to be requalified on her firearm every year. She had to be tested and recertified on her taser every year in order to carry it. And she had additional training just a month before this incident. On March 2nd of 2021, she passed all the requirements to be certified on this Taser 7. Now, before I cover all the details of the policies and what happened with her training, I'm going to talk a little bit about Dante Wright and the events of April 11th of this year. Dante Wright was Katie Bryant and Aubrey Wright's first child together. He was their first son as a couple, and he lived at home with his parents and his two younger sisters, Diamond and Destiny. And he had 6 siblings in total. It was a large, blended family. A large family with a lot of love to go around. Dante Wright also had dreams for his future. When he was little, he wanted to be a professional basketball player. Who doesn't? And as he got older, he had a number of jobs in retail, food service. And you'll hear that he spent some time working with his dad at the same shoe store. And not long before his death, he had plans to enroll in a trade school to pursue a career at Summit Academy. Now, Dante Wright also had a son of his own, Dante Jr. Dante Jr. was 1 year old at the time of this incident, a toddler, now fatherless. And on April 11th, Dante Wright himself was just 20 years old, just out of his teens, still had a close relationship with his mother. And he had a new baby boy, a loving family, and his whole adult life ahead of him. Now, on April 11th, Dante Wright went to his parents' house. His mother, Katie Bryant, was watching his son, Junior, on that day. And Dante Wright had recently been given the family car, a white Buick, as his own. And he was excited about that. And after getting this car, that was now his own, he wanted to get a car wash. That's what his plan was for April 11th. So his mom, Katie Bryant, gave him some money, and he left with his girlfriend, Elena Albrecht Payton, in the car. He headed out, and he later called his mom to figure out where he should go, which car wash was the right one. But he didn't make it. He never made it to the car wash that day. And he never made it home. Why? Because he was shot dead in his car in the middle of the day by the defendant. Now, what was the defendant doing on April 11th? On April 11th, the defendant had been a police officer for longer than Dante Wright had been alive. On April 11th, the defendant was acting as a field training officer, FTO. She was training in a new officer whose name is Officer Lucky. And on April 11th, while out on patrol, the defendant and Officer Lucky saw an air freshener, a little tree, hanging from the rearview mirror of Dante Wright's car. And they decided to stop the vehicle. Yes, for the air freshener. But as they stopped the car, they also noticed the tabs were expired. But this was a run-of-the-mill traffic stop. This is the kind of stop that happens every day. So after they pulled over this white Buick that Dante Wright was driving, it was Officer Lucky, the trainee, who initially approached the car. Officer Lucky approached the car. He made contact with Dante Wright, and the defendant stayed back in the squad and observed from a distance. Officer Lucky interacted with Dante Wright. He explained the reason for the stop. And Dante Wright gave Officer Lucky his information. He gave him his name. He gave him his full name, including his middle name, his date of birth, his address, his brother's name. He answered all the questions that were asked of him. And then Officer Lucky took that information back to the squad car and talked to the defendant. And when Officer Lucky returned to the squad car, what had scared 20-year-old Dante Wright do? He called his mom. And in these COVID times, the tabs had not been updated. He didn't have an up-to-date license. He didn't have a proper insurance card. And he was trying to figure out the situation. So he called his mom for help. And back at the squad car, Officer Lucky acknowledged to the defendant that Dante Wright had been forthcoming with him. And he told the defendant that he believed that Dante Wright was telling him the truth. He then ran the name through their system, and the defendant, who's his trainer, corrected him. The defendant corrected Officer Lucky when he entered the name in the wrong way. And once they ran the name, the defendant and Officer Lucky found, yes, in fact, that Dante Wright had an outstanding warrant for a failure to appear on a gross misdemeanor weapons violation. So in the squad car, the defendant and Officer Lucky, they discussed their plan, and they decided to arrest Dante Wright on that warrant. And the defendant in the squad corrected Officer Lucky a second time when he code 4'd himself too early. Code 4 being just giving the all clear before he had that information completely from their system on the warrant. And while they're having this conversation, Sergeant Johnson, another Brooklyn Center Police Department officer, came on scene. And he approached the squad, talked to Officer Lucky and the defendant about what was going on. They filled him in. They did not express concerns for their safety. They did not decide to approach the car with guns drawn. They simply decided to arrest Dante Wright on the warrant. This was nothing out of the ordinary for the defendant, a 26-year veteran of the Brooklyn Center Police Department. And on this day, she was training Officer Lucky. She was responsible for showing him the proper way to do things as a Brooklyn Center police officer. And she did not direct Officer Lucky to approach the vehicle any differently than he had before. So Officer Lucky walked back to the driver's side of the Buick where Dante Wright was. And the defendant got out of the squad but stood back to watch. Officer Lucky asked Dante Wright to put his phone on the dash, asked him to step out of the car, and Dante Wright complied. Now, when Officer Lucky began to handcuff Dante Wright and told him that there was a warrant and that he was under arrest, that was when scared Dante tried to get away. He tried to get back in the car. He tried to leave. Dante Wright was unarmed. He had no weapon. He was not violent. He did not threaten the officers in any way. He didn't reach for anything. He got in the car, put his hands on the steering wheel. He didn't come at the officers, didn't throw any punches, didn't kick anyone. He just pulled away, got back in the car, while Officer Lucky was trying to maintain his grip on Dante Wright's clothing to pull him back out. So Dante puts his hands on the steering wheel, he puts his foot down on the brake, he does the things that you do to get ready to drive a car. At that point, Officer Lucky reaches in from the driver's side and tries to turn off the car, and meanwhile, Sergeant Johnson, who has approached on the passenger side, grabs Dante Wright's right arm, right hand, from the passenger side of the vehicle to try to get control of him. But he kept his feet planted firmly on the ground. He tried to turn off the car from that side, tried to get Dante Wright under control. So Officer Lucky and Sergeant Johnson continued to engage. Now at that point, the defendant approached the vehicle behind Officer Lucky. She intervened and she interfered. Officer Lucky was her trainee and she was the FTO. So she was the one who determined how this stop would go. She was the 26-year veteran. She was the officer in charge. And it was her job to show Officer Lucky how it's done. And what did she show him? She showed him how to kill someone. Now, as soon as she gets involved, she escalates the situation. She acts rashly and impetuously. She draws her firearm. She draws it with her right hand from the right side of her duty belt, where she's always kept her gun. She draws it with her finger on the trigger. And she points it directly at Dante Wright's chest. Now, at the same time, there are two other officers, as you can see here, with hands on or interacting with Dante Wright. Officer Lucky is to the front of her and sometimes to the side, and Sergeant Johnson on the other side of the vehicle. And Dante Wright's girlfriend, Elena Albrecht Payton, is in the passenger seat, right next to him. They're all within a few feet of the muzzle of the defendant's gun. Now, the defendant says, "I'll tase you." And then she says again, "I'll tase you," a second time. And then, "Taser, taser, taser," which prompts the officers to let go of Dante's arms and then disengage. But she points the gun at Dante for more than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5 seconds. Aims, pulls the trigger, and fires into his chest. And when she pulled that trigger, these people were all still around him, including these two other officers, Officer Lucky and Sergeant Johnson on the other side, and Elena Albrecht Payton in the passenger seat. And when she pulls that trigger, she fires directly under Officer Lucky's face, with Officer Lucky's arm reaching over the top of where her gun is. When she pulls that trigger, Dante Wright is in the driver's seat of that car. He has his foot off and on the brake, and the car is running on a busy street in the middle of the day. She did all this despite her training. She had been trained year after year after year to prevent this kind of thing from happening, but she did it anyway. Now, after she shot Dante Wright, the defendant admitted she had messed up big time. Here's what she said. And I killed a boy. Now, I'm going to play for you now a short video clip of some of the evidence that you'll see in this case. It's a composite. It's 2 videos on the screen at the same time. One is a clip from the defendant's own body-worn camera, and one is the squad camera. They're synced up for you so you can see. But this is just a very small portion of what you'll see in this trial. This just shows the few seconds around this incident.
continue.
Sam Stefano.
Alright, man, here, do me a favor. Okay, so you already been arrested,
You got a warrant.
You have a warrant. Don't. I'm not doing nothing. Don't. You're tasting up, bro. Don't do it. Don't do it. Hey, don't.
I'll tase you! I'll tase you! Tase I just shot him.
Members of the jury, there is no do-over when you walk the streets with a loaded firearm. When you're entrusted with a deadly weapon as part of your job, there's no do-over when you take a young man's life. Now, this was exactly what she had been trained for years to prevent, but on April 11th, she betrayed her badge and she failed Dante Wright. Now, after the defendant shot him, Dante Wright's car traveled about a block down the street. It crossed the median and it hit another vehicle that was traveling in the opposite direction. And you'll hear from Patricia Lundgren, who was driving that other vehicle. She and her husband were coming down the road when they were hit by Dante Wright's car. And you'll also hear from Elena Albrecht Payton, the passenger who was riding with Dante Wright. And she'll tell you about the crash and the injuries she suffered. Now, you'll also see and hear about the fact that after the defendant shot Dante Wright and the car crashed a block away, she didn't do anything to help him. She didn't call for assistance. She didn't render aid. She didn't communicate any information about what had happened to her fellow officers who were responding. And when they showed up down the block, they didn't know that Dante had been shot. Dante Wright had been shot. They didn't know that the defendant had shot him. And they didn't know what they were dealing with at all. So almost 10 minutes later, a small army of officers approach with guns drawn and drag Dante Wright's dead body out of the car at gunpoint. And the defendant did nothing. You'll also hear from paramedics that Dante Wright was declared dead on scene. And then the BCA arrived to investigate the matter. And the medical examiner's office came and they collected the body. There was no bringing him back. You'll hear from the medical examiner, the assistant medical examiner in this case, who conducted the autopsy, Dr. Jackson. And he'll tell you about his examination, his autopsy procedure, and his findings in this case. And you'll see photos of Dante Wright's injuries. And you'll see that gunshot wound that tore through his heart. Dr. Jackson will also tell you that he recovered a projectile from Dante Wright's body, the bullet, after it ripped through his insides and got lodged in his chest wall. And he'll describe for you the condition that it was in, that peeling back of that metal, and how that's consistent with a hollow point bullet. And he'll also tell you about his findings on cause and manner of death. cause of Mr. Wright's death was a gunshot wound to the chest, and the manner of Mr. Wright's death was homicide. You'll also hear from a useful force expert in this case who will tell you about the use of the weapons at issue here. And he'll tell you that it was objectively unreasonable for the defendant to use her firearm. And he'll tell you that even the use of the taser would have been unwise under these circumstances. Members of the jury, I'd like to take a moment to discuss what this case is not about. It's not about intent to kill. That's not why you're here today.
Objection argumentative.
The objection is overruled. You may.
Thank you, Your Honor. The judge will give you the law, and she'll give you instructions on the law to apply at the end of this case. But intent is not an element of any of the charges at issue here, and it's not something that the state will have to prove. That the defendant didn't intend to kill Mr. Wright or that she didn't mean to shoot him with her gun, if you hear those things, they have nothing to do with the charges at hand. Indeed, if the defendant had meant to do these things, if she had meant to shoot her gun into Dante Wright's body, we would be talking about intentional murder and not the charges at hand. And that's not the case you have before you. The defendant is not charged with intentional murder. No one will say that she wanted him dead. No one will say that she wanted this to happen. And no one is even saying that she meant to shoot him with her gun. But the evidence will show that's what she did. She fired her gun at point-blank range into Dante Wright's chest. She unholstered her weapon. She drew it. She aimed it. She pointed it directly at Dante Wright. And she pulled the trigger and she shot him in the chest. And she did those things without bothering to confirm what was in her hand. Firing a weapon, blindly assuming it to be a taser, after drawing the wrong weapon from the wrong side. She did all those things with a gun. That's what she actually did. A gun loaded with hollow point bullets. The kind that expand on impact. The kind that tear up someone's insides. She did this with a firearm that she was issued, that was part of her job, that she was entrusted to carry in the course of her duties, to serve and protect. So as a result of all of this, the state has charged 2 crimes. First-degree manslaughter and second-degree manslaughter. And again, the law you will apply will come from the judge at the end of this case. But these charges are in the realm of recklessness and culpable negligence. Those terms will be defined for you by the court later. But the law in Minnesota criminalizes all kinds of reckless conduct. Things like reckless driving, reckless child endangerment, reckless handling of a firearm, and in certain cases, manslaughter. And that is what this case is about. It's about the reckless handling of a firearm, and it's about the disregard of known risks. It's about an officer who knew she could kill someone if she got it wrong, but she failed to make sure she got it right. You may also hear at some point during this case, this incident might be described as an unfortunate mistake or a tragic accident. Or that because the defendant didn't know she had a gun in her hand, that this should be called an accident and not a crime. And again, the law you will apply will come from the judge. Those are the instructions that you will follow. But that's simply not the case.
Counsel,
Members of the jury.
please stick to the facts. Okay.
This case is also not about Dante Wright. Dante Wright.
That's just his argument. I checked. She's given her opening statement. Now she's arguing her case.
I'd like you to just stick with a bird's eye view of the facts that you think will go in and no argument counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. You'll hear about the training. You'll hear about the policies. There will be evidence of all of those things presented in this case. And I'm going to highlight some of those things for you. The defendant's history of training over a 26-year period as a Brooklyn Center police officer will be evidence in this case that you will have to consider in the connection with the charges at issue. Now, over the course of her career, the defendant received extensive training on a variety of topics, year in and year out. She had training on firearms, training on tasers, training on use of force, and that included all types of things. Readiness to use force, scenario-based training, so real-life type situations where you have to react under stress, choose the right type of weapon, choose the appropriate response. She was trained to do all this under stressful conditions. She was also trained to maintain calm, manage stress, and make those decisions in the moment, out on the street. But the evidence will show that she flouted her training and she flouted policy. I'm going to give you a highlight of some of those policies and trainings. Now, when it comes to firearms, she was required to successfully complete training on her firearm every year. She had to be requalified, in addition to the quarterly training she received. And she was also instructed by policy that she should not unnecessarily display or handle any firearm. That's part of the policy. The use of force policy instructs officers they shall only use the amount of force that reasonably appears necessary in a particular situation. There's also policy on moving vehicles and how officers should use or not use their firearms in those situations. And that policy indicates that an officer should only discharge a firearm at a moving vehicle or its occupants if deadly force other than the vehicle is directed at the officers or others. Policy also says that officers should not utilize firearms during an ongoing pursuit unless the conditions and circumstances meet the requirements for deadly force. There's also policy on de-escalation, that officers should use non-violent strategies and techniques to decrease the intensity of a situation, to improve decision-making, to improve communication, and to reduce the need for force. Now, in addition to training on policy and training on firearms and use of force, you'll hear about policy on tasers. And the policy on tasers for Brooklyn Center is known as conducted energy device policy. And policy says that the purpose of the taser is to control violent suspects as opposed to fleeing suspects. And that appropriate use should result in fewer serious injuries to both officers and suspects. And you will see that mere flight from a pursuing officer is not good cause for the use of a taser. And you will also learn that Brooklyn Center policy says that the use of a taser should be avoided where collateral injury might result. Collateral injury, meaning someone else could get hurt or killed. And that includes on individuals who are operating vehicles. You'll also hear that tasers require training as well in order to carry them. that in order to carry a taser, officers have to complete successfully their department training. Now you'll learn that policy also dictates how those should be carried in a reaction side holster. Again, that's the non-dominant side, on the opposite side of the duty weapon. It also requires that those items be distinctly marked, that they look different, and that officers should not hold them both at the same time. And we'll talk about some of those differences, and you'll hear about them during the course of the trial. Now, you'll see in this picture the defendant's Taser 7 up top in yellow, and the Glock 9mm handgun pictured at the bottom. And you'll hear about the differences between these two items. The color, for one, well, it sounds like stating the obvious perhaps. The Taser is bright yellow, the Glock is black. The differences in weight you will learn about. Now, the Taser weighs 0.94 pounds, and the Glock, the firearm, when loaded with 17 rounds of ammunition, it weighs 2.11 pounds. That's more than twice as much. Now, you'll also hear about the differences in safety, in the display, and the laser that comes on the Taser, and the holster location. And I'll talk about those things too. Now, when it comes to the safety, a safety is just a mechanism or a button of some kind, a switch in some cases, that makes a weapon inoperable. And the Taser 7 has a safety on the side that you have to flip up right there in order to arm the device. It has to be engaged. And the Glock, the firearm, has no safety switch like that. It has a trigger safety. So basically, you pull the trigger on the Glock and it fires. Now when it comes to the display, well, when you flip up the safety on a Taser, it arms the device. It means it's ready to use. And when you do that, when that switch is lifted up, three things happen. A display screen comes on the back of the Taser. Green and red laser lights appear coming out of the front of the Taser, and they appear on the target that you're aiming at. And the flashlight also turns on. And that display screen is pictured here on the back of the Taser. It faces the operator who's holding it. The person holding the Taser sees this display screen when it's on. And the lasers, the top laser comes out of the top cartridge, a green laser light that appears on the target showing where that top prong would deploy. And depending on which cartridge you're using, one of two red laser lights appears. But there's a green light and a red light that appear on the target when you aim the Taser after it's been armed. Now you'll also see for yourselves and hear about the defendant's duty belt that holds her gun and her Taser holsters. Now, on the right of the screen is the Taser in its holster. The Taser holster is made of plastic. It has a latch right here that has to be depressed. You have to push down on a button to release the Taser from its holster. You press down on that button and then rock the Taser backward. The Taser has to lean back, rock back, to be pulled up and out of the holster. Now the firearm holster, which is on the left side here, empty in this photograph, is made of a soft leather-like material, and it has a snap that just releases and the gun comes straight out. Now, as you saw before, Taser and firearms have to be holstered in different ways pursuant to policy. the policy requires that the taser be carried on the reaction side, the non-dominant side. And the firearm, the gun, is carried on the dominant side. In this case, the defendant's right hand side is where she kept her gun. Her left side is where she kept her taser. Now you'll hear about that requirement. The policy requires that officers carry those weapons on separate sides of their body. Officers are given a choice when it comes to how those tasers are positioned on their non-dominant side. Now, the choice is a cross draw or a straight draw. Now, for a cross draw, the officers use their right hand, reach over the body with the right hand to pull out the taser. In that situation, as pictured in the top here, the butt of the grip points forward to make that cross motion so that the officer would pull that taser with that right hand in a case as pictured here. Now, the defendant had her holster set up in a straight draw. The added protection of having the taser come out with her left hand. When a taser is positioned on the left side of the body in a straight draw, the butt of the gun points backward, and the officer has to rock the taser out and pull it up with the left hand. Straight draw taser is to be drawn with the left hand. The defendant had her duty belt and her holsters positioned so that she would have to draw her taser with her left hand. Now, the defendant had chosen this setup and this additional protection in the way that she carried, and she had done this consistently for years, and you'll see evidence of that. She carried in a straight draw position in 2016, left side, straight draw. 2017, left side, straight draw. 2018, left side, straight draw. 2019, left side, straight draw. 2020, again, left side, straight draw, including April 11th of this year, left side, straight draw. She had her taser positioned on her left side, as required by policy, with the added protection of straight draw, pulling it with her left hand. Her Glock, her firearm, again, by policy, on the right side of her duty belt. So the only weapon she draws with her right hand is her gun, not her taser. You'll hear about policy on targeting when it comes to the taser as well. Policy says that officers should target lower center mass, but they should avoid the head, the neck, the chest, and the groin, sensitive areas of the body. And you'll also hear about taser training and how the policy requires training, and you'll hear about the training that they go through as well. But the training is required to include performing reaction hand draws or cross draws, which is not applicable to her, to reduce the possibility of accidentally drawing and firing a firearm. Policy requires that when they are trained, they practice. They practice drawing that taser with that left hand with the straight draw. It's required by policy. You'll see some of those records, the records of the defendant's training. Every year she received classroom training, hands-on training, and instruction, practice on this taser, on the tasers that she was issued, and that included the recent certification. In 2015, she was trained and certified. In 2016, she was trained and certified. In 2017 and 2018, she was trained and certified. And in addition, she had to acknowledge that she had received the product warnings and that she understood those warnings at the time that she was recertified on her Taser. And she acknowledged receiving them every year she was trained. This is 2019 and 2020, and you'll see those records. And again, in that most recent training, March 2nd, 2021, she once again acknowledged receiving and understanding those product warnings. Now these trainings, like the one on March 2nd, also include reviewing the PowerPoint presentations, demonstrating safe handling, performing de-escalation arcs. Basically, being able to use these tasers in safe ways. And again, on March 2nd, 2021, she indicated that she understood and received the warnings. The Axon product warning. Axon is just the parent company for Taser. She understood those warnings. And what did those warnings say? They said, confusing a handgun with a CEW, a Taser, could result in death or serious injury. Learn the differences in the physical feel and holstering characteristics between your CEW, Taser, and your handgun to help avoid confusion. Always follow your agency's guidance and training. And those PowerPoints and that training that she went through continue to remind officers of those risks. Those PowerPoints that she had to sit through to be certified every year included that Tasers are not risk-free. They can cause death or serious injury. The PowerPoints themselves set forth that the course attendees, the officers, had to acknowledge that they had read and understood that Taser warning that you just saw. They included that Tasers are serious weapons and should be treated as such. This was all part of the training. And over the years, they also talked about the benefits and the risks with respect to the way that you carry your Taser. And they specifically had in their training that the benefits of carrying a Taser on the non-dominant side had associated issues. That includes, let me rephrase. If you carry your Taser on the dominant side, if you're right-handed and you carry your Taser on the dominant side, they had instructed their trainees there's a higher risk of weapon confusion. They talked about the risk of weapon confusion in those trainings. They explained that there were known incidents of shootings by mistaken weapon confusion. This was part of the training going back at least as early as 2016. They trained that you could kill someone and there were incidents of shootings when you made the mistake and pulled the wrong weapon. And so they explained why it makes sense to carry your Taser on the other side of your body. And they direct officers to refer to your department's tactical experts and make your own policy on how to carry, holster, and deploy. They instructed about the known risks. Those risks also included instruction on risks of injury to people operating vehicles or machinery, and risks if someone is tased in the heart or chest area. Those trainings also included smart use considerations. And those smart use considerations explain that if there's no immediate safety risk, slow down and consider alternative force options. And they explain that physical resistance alone does not equal an immediate safety risk. The training materials themselves tell you to reevaluate. The training materials also tell officers to be aware, to be careful, and to be aware of stress and how stress can influence these situations. And they instruct that officers have been accused of using excessive Taser exposures due to stress or distractions. Be alert and avoid potential distractions. This is part of the training. And they talk about where to target, where you should aim the Taser if you're using it. The trainings say to target the back, that the back is the most preferred target area. And that's because it contains larger muscle groups and reduces the risk of hitting sensitive body areas. And it tells you on the front, you should, if you have to, tase at the front, tase below the chest, split the belt line, increase that distance between those probes so you don't tase near the heart and you don't tase the chest. And the reason for that is there are cardiac risks associated with tasing someone in the chest. So the training materials say, target the back, avoid the chest, avoid the heart region. And the taser training materials also say that historically, over time, these deployments have been most effective from 7 to 15 feet away. Use this distance where you can to have a higher hit probability, good probe spread, if you want these items to be effective and to achieve that neuromuscular incapacitation. Because they may not work if you don't have the appropriate distance between your probes. The taser training materials also talk about a spark or functionality test. The training materials say that a full 5-second spark or functionality test should be conducted once every 24 hours. That's in the training materials. It's also in the policy. And you'll hear evidence that the defendant failed to spark test her taser for the 2 days prior to this incident. You'll hear that she didn't do that, even though it was required by policy. And even these slides on spark testing explain that you should be aware of potential stress. And over again, throughout the years, every time she's seeing these slides, she's seeing that the tasers are not risk-free. That repeated messaging, big letters, read the warnings, understand them. Understand that tasers can cause death or serious injury. Understand the risks of weapons confusion. But the evidence will show that the defendant flouted that training and she disregarded her fundamental duty to safeguard life. I killed a boy. I killed a boy. Those were the defendant's words. That's what she said after she did what she did. On April 11th of this year, the defendant shot and killed Dante Wright, a 20-year-old who had an air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror. A kid in a Heartbreaker jean jacket. But on April 11th of this year, Dante Wright was not the Heartbreaker. It was Dante Wright who had his heart broken. And it was the defendant who broke Dante Wright's heart when she fired a hollow point bullet straight into his chest. Thank you.